Great. We continue through the book of Philippians. So you can open up your Bible app, or if you have your page Bible, Philippians chapter 4, as we continue to, or as we come to an end. Lord willing, this is the second last sermon in Philippians, and I trust that it's been a great journey. Certainly has been for me, encouraging and strengthening and convicting all at the same time. Last week we looked at our mental health. You remember that Paul told us that we can protect our minds, our inner beings, by filling our minds with the right stuff so as to then live out the right things. And as we would do that, there's that amazing promise that the God of peace will be with us. We'll be aware of the God of peace being with us. This morning, we're going to be talking about how to be content. How to be content. Something I'm sure we all long for and desire, but something I'm sure we all struggle to achieve. And sure, yes, we might have moments or even seasons in life where we feel pretty satisfied and content, but how come we can't have it all the time? I don't know about you, but sometimes even the smallest things can disrupt my contentment. Like it happened so many times this past week, walking all the way from the car to the shop or to the coffee shop, only to realize, I've forgotten my mask and have to walk all the way back and get it, and then you have to wear your mask the whole time while you're in Foster's or Kirk or wherever it might be. Or maybe you've made plans that will bring you a sense of contentment and peace and just, be able to relax, maybe kick back on the couch or go snorkeling at Eden Rock or go, just take out all your stress at the gym, and then you get a phone call, something disrupts those plans, and there's an emergency at work, and you just happen to be the only person who can fix the problem. Or maybe your car breaks down, and now it's such an inconvenience to find alternate ways of getting around the island until they order the right part. Or maybe things are going great until there's change, right? Change kind of disrupts our contentment. Work is great until, they moved you to be a part of a new team or a new department, or they hired him or they hired her, and you just kind of don't see eye to eye at all. You were hoping for a promotion and it didn't come through, or you're hoping for better results or better outcomes, but you got the opposite. And so many things can either contribute towards our contentment or take away from our contentment. And if we just stand back for a second and try to get some perspective, we'll see that so much of our contentment is based on our circumstances and our situations. It's so reliant on the places or the spaces and the circumstances and the situations that we're in. If I could just change this, or if I could just change that, then everything will be fine. Or if I could just get that, then everything will be perfect. But what we're going to see in our passage this morning is that we shouldn't place our contentment in our circumstances and our situations, because they change all of the time and they're mostly out of our control. Contentment thrives where there is consistency. And so we need to find it in something or someone else. So with that in mind, let's read the next section of Philippians 4 from verses 10 to 13. Paul writes, and he says this: I rejoiced in the Lord greatly that now at length you have revived your concern for me. You were indeed concerned for me, but you had no opportunity. Not that I am speaking of being in need, for I have learned in whatever situation I am to be content. I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound. In any and every circumstance I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. So here's what I think Paul is proposing for us this morning, that as Christians, we can become content with an overriding sense of God's control over any and all circumstances. Notice that I say become content, because this is something that we are to grow in. This is something, as Paul says, we are to learn. And just learn this overriding sense that, hey, God has got this. God has got us. Paul is going to show us that Jesus is the one true consistent thing in this life who has control over all things, and therefore he should and must become the source of our contentment. So here's where we're going this morning. We can become content through, number one, the providence of God. I'll explain that in a second. We're going to kind of camp out there for most of our time, because that's going to lay the foundation. Then number two, fighting off consumerism. And then the last way to become content is through this secret strength. So here we go. Point number one, we can become content through the providence of God. Now, let me tell you, this is one of the core foundations to the Christian joy and to our contentment. The providence of God is a priceless doctrine that if we get it and if we believe it, it will radically change our lives. It will radically alter our lives. Not just in terms of our contentment, but also in the context of the whole of chapter 4 that we've been seeing in terms of unity in our relationships, fighting off anxiety, and even our mental health, as we saw last week. So what is it? What is the providence of God? It's a very intricate word in the original languages that not only means God's foreknowledge, that's God's supernatural ability to know all things, past, present, and future, all at the same time, because remember, God is eternal. He operates outside of time. He's not bound by time, and so he knows all things, past, present, and future, at the same time. And then coupled with that is his supernatural ability to be in control over all things, or his supernatural ability to provide for his creation. You see, God interacts with his creation in at least two ways. One is through miracles. God disrupts the unique order of this fallen world, or he goes against the nature of something to bring about his plans and purposes. Someone has a broken leg, and even with their proper amount of medical care, will still take months and months to heal. But God can, excuse the pun, kind of break in that moment and heal their leg in an instant. Or someone who's dying on their deathbed of cancer or whatever it might be, God can break in that moment and heal that person in an instant. And doctors are baffled. We don't get it. You're supposed to be dead, or you're supposed to be dying. Well, now you can climb Mount Everest. We don't understand, and that's exactly the point. God is overriding the natural with the supernatural. The second way God interacts or intervenes in his creation and in our lives is through this term providence. The big difference between miracles and providence is that miracles are kind of we can say maybe random, but God is constantly providentially at work in our lives. I like to define it like this: God is constantly working all things for our good and for his glory, or according to his glory, which should sound familiar to us because it comes from Romans 8:28. It says, and we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. That's why we say according to his glory. Our good that he's working is defined by his purposes. It's defined by what will bring him glory. But that little word causes tells us so much about the nature of God's providence. It tells us that he's more powerful and has more authority than anything else because he is able to take everything, use everything for our good. There's no disclaimer that says, oh, well, except for the devil, because he's super powerful, or except for, when you decide to do something according to your own will. No, he is all powerful. He has all authority over all things all the time. The other little thing that word tells us is that he is constantly at work. The term all things doesn't just mean, the big events of your life or the big bad events of your life. No, all things is all things, meaning even the small, everyday, mundane, non-eventful things. All of it is being providentially used for your good and according to his glory. And I'm hoping that's the most comforting thing that you hear, because to realize that this all-powerful God is constantly at work in and over your life should be the most satisfying and most comforting thing for us. I mean, take, for example, one of my favorite stories, the story of Joseph in the Old Testament. You remember God gives this young teenage boy these dreams that kind of indicate that he will be in a position of authority one day. And God doesn't give him too much information because, as we see, he already starts to brag about it to his brothers, which kind of just compounds their anger and their hatred and their jealousy toward him. And so they conspire to kill him. But again, by God's providence, they end up selling him into slavery and off to Egypt. Now, at this point, if you don't know how it ended, you would begin to doubt this whole providential thing, and you'd probably begin to beg God for a miracle. Like Joseph, maybe please just snap these chains so that I can run back to my father's house. But throughout the story, we find this little phrase that says, but the Lord was with Joseph. When Joseph was a slave in Potiphar's house, it says this in Genesis 39:2. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man. And he was in the house of his Egyptian master. His master saw that the Lord was with him, so it was evident. And look at this. And that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. There's that sovereign, providential word again. But then, just when things seem to be going really well for Joseph, just when he's beginning to feel really content in his new life, and maybe he's thinking, well, this is the fulfillment of God's dream that he gave me. I'm in a position of authority. No one is higher than me, than Potiphar. I'm in charge of his entire estate, and so maybe this is what God was telling me all this time. But then he's falsely accused of rape and he's thrown into prison. But no sooner is he thrown into prison when that little phrase pops up again. Look at this, just a couple of verses on in verse 21. So he's in prison. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. So can you see God orchestrating all things for good despite the place that Joseph was in, despite his circumstances, despite his situations? No miracle here at all, just the divine providence of God. And eventually, after many years of training and pruning by God, because God's not just working in our circumstances, He's working in our hearts, He's working on our characters. Joseph gets this opportunity to interpret Pharaoh's dreams, and to cut a long story short, he gets promoted to governor of Egypt. In other words, no one is higher than Joseph, than the Pharaoh himself, and so he's in charge of all things. Again, we fast forward the story. Joseph's brothers come to Egypt because they come seeking grain because this famine has become so bad and so far widespread. And so Joseph begins interacting with them, and at some point he then reveals his identity to them. And they think, oh boy, we're done. They start freaking out because now Joseph, he's going to take us out because of what we did to him. But Joseph was a man who recognized the providential care of God in all his circumstances. And in his contentment in God, he's able to give a contented response to them. Look at Genesis 15 from verse 19. It said, but Joseph said to them, to his brothers, do not fear, for am I in the place of God? It's a rhetorical question. Am I not where I'm supposed to be? Because the bowing down of his brothers before him is the fulfillment of God's plan for Joseph. It's just that Joseph is now no longer this arrogant teenage boy, but he's a mature, well-rounded, molded leader of God. God has used all of the circumstances and all of those situations in his life to mold Joseph into the leader that he is now. But notice how Joseph recognizes the providence of God behind it all. Look at verse 20, and this is kind of known as the Romans 8:28 of the Old Testament. He says this, as for you, brothers, you meant evil against me, but God meant it, or we could say caused it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. Talking about how God gave him the strategy to store up grain to be able to provide for so many people during the famine. But are you beginning to see why the doctrine of the providence of God is so key to our contentment? I mean, if you don't remember anything else from this morning, just remember that little phrase, well, you meant evil against me, but God. But God meant it for good. I mean, you can fill in your own current situation in there. That person meant to hurt me, and they did, but God is going to use it for my good. Or my past was really, really tough, but God is using it for my good. Or my current situation is really frustrating. It's really confusing, but I know God means it for my ultimate good. See, God doesn't always take away our situations, but He's constantly redeeming them for us. You see, maybe the reason why we're not content is because we have this expectation of God to make everything perfect. to make all of our situations perfect. God, if you just take care of that, God, if you just sort him out, or if you just sort her out, then everything would be fine in my life. See, that's a secular view of contentment, and will never be satisfied. God wants us to find our contentment in Him. That's why we said at the beginning, we can become content with an ever-increasing sense of God's overriding control over any and all of our circumstances. Trying to find contentment in the circumstances and the situations of this fallen world is like banging our heads against a wall to get rid of our headaches. And now, the Apostle Paul was a man who exemplified satisfaction in God despite his circumstances. Look at verse 10 now of Philippians 4. He says, I rejoiced in the Lord greatly that now at length you have revived your concern for me. He says, you were indeed concerned for me, but you had no opportunity. And so he's speaking about this gift that Epaphroditus brought all the way from the Philippian church, all the way to Rome, to Paul, who was under house arrest. So what does this have to do with God's providence? Well, notice what or who Paul is rejoicing in. He's not rejoicing in the gift. He's not rejoicing in their concern. He's rejoicing in God. He says, I can't stop praising God first and foremost for all of this, because he knows. He knows all things are from God. He knows God is orchestrating all things. Just like the Lord was with Joseph in prison, so he has been with Paul, orchestrating all of the things in Paul's life for his good. The second thing we see here is that the Lord uses secondary means to provide for us. In this case, the love and the care of the Philippians. That word revived there means to bloom. Their love for Paul has bloomed again. It doesn't mean that, at one stage their love for Paul grew cold, because he says, you've always been concerned for me, but you lacked the opportunity. You had no opportunity. And again, that's another horticultural term referring to seasons. Their love and their concern for Paul has bloomed because now is the season for it. And we know that God is in control of all of our seasons. He's in control of all seasons, literally and metaphorically and spiritually. It's God who brought about the season or this opportunity for them to provide for Paul. Maybe now they had managed to track down where Paul was according to God's providence. Or maybe now they had eventually gathered up enough of a donation or gift or whatever it might have been, again, according to God's grace and providence. And Paul realizes this. He realizes God's hand in this, and he's rejoicing in it. So step number one in becoming a content person, Sunrise, is it's realizing that God is supremely in charge of all things in our lives and all the circumstances, and he's causing them, orchestrating them to work for our good. God has power over all things, God has the authority over all things, and God is involved, constantly involved in all things. If we can realize that, then we're on our way to becoming a contented person. We need to find our rest in that and rejoice in that. That then leads us to the very important thing that we have to unlearn. So point number 2, we can become content through fighting off consumerism. We have to unlearn a consumer mentality. Last week I shared a stat that the average American, by the time they reach the age of 20, they would have watched over 800,000 commercials. Commercials are designed to engage our desires, engage our wants, and to promise contentment. And they're brilliant in how they go about doing that. Some appeal to our emotions, whether that be, heartfelt emotion or to our humor. Others appeal to our sense of justice, like, hey, it's just wrong if you don't use this product because this product is environmentally friendly. You'll be a bad person if you don't use it, but you'll be better than anyone else if you do use it. Or they appeal to our comfort. And so their definition of contentment is to be comfortable. So they're saying, get this or get that, and you will achieve a certain level of satisfaction in your life. Others appeal to our status. Get the latest iPhone, get the latest this, and you will be content. And then what happens, right? A month or so later, well, here's the better version. of what you bought last month. And if that made you happy, well, this is going to blow your mind. You need it. I mean, companies hire consumer psychologists. I didn't even know something like that existed. They hire consumer psychologists to study how our thoughts, beliefs, feelings, and perceptions influence how we buy and relate to various goods and services. And then they give this information to these companies who then design products around that or design their marketing strategy around that. I mean, I'm amazed at the adverts that pop up on my YouTube feed or other social media pages. It's like they're reading my mind, right? And of course, I'm not being all fundamental and saying that, we need to become Amish, although yes, like according to last week, we do need to protect our minds. But there is a certain amount of good in this consumer and market-driven world. For instance, I wouldn't have discovered good medicinal and health products if it weren't for some adverts. A lot of products that have helped my family and myself with our health and adopting healthier lifestyles. But the question for us is how are we not overtaken by it? How can we be more self-controlled when it comes to shopping on Amazon? Just a click here, click there, wait 2 months, and boom, it's on your doorstep type of thing. 2 months. Let's see what Paul says next. Look at verse 11. It says, "Not that I am speaking of being in need." I'm thinking, what? You're kidding, Paul. You're chained to a Roman soldier, probably in some dingy dump of a place and barely being fed. So how could he say this? How come he's not saying, I really miss my morning latte and my bagel from the coffee shop at the corner and an overdue haircut at my favorite barber and a fresh tunic from Luigi down the road or wherever it might be? Here's his reason. Look at this. He says, "For I have learned in whatever situation I am to be content." He says, "I know how to be brought low and I know how to abound." He says contentment is something that has to be learned. So we unlearn consumerism by learning contentment. And the primary lesson, the main thing that we are to learn, he says, is that contentment is not based on your needs being met or how pleasant or unpleasant your circumstances are. I'm amazed at how verse 12 includes situations where he had plenty. Paul, what he's saying is Paul was content despite being in situations where his needs were supplied. I mean, the world today would say, Paul, that should have been the only time you were content. 2 bagels instead of 1 and a fresh tunic plus 5 back in your cupboard, or like preaching the gospel wherever you want without restrictions, without any persecution. That's when you should be content. That's the contented life. Plus your annual leave to the Red Sea. Don't be content until you have that, Paul. You've got to fight for your contentment in your situations and your circumstances. The lesson to be learned is that contentment, as he says here, is a state of being, not a state of circumstance, whether good or bad. And your state of being comes from a rest in the ultimate being of God, whom we have just seen is in control of all things. See, this also involves our identity. Our identity is not shaped by consumerism, although that is what very clever marketing skill will try and prove otherwise. Get this so that you can be that. Our identity is as the children of God who are cared for by a very loving Heavenly Father. Remember, Jesus taught us in the Lord's Prayer, he said, "Our Father." Our Father. So we are his children. He is our Father. But he says, "Our Father in heaven." That's a big Father. He's reigning. He's ruling. He has authority over all things. But yet he's our Father. And then he goes on to say, "Who gives us our daily bread." We are to rely on him daily to provide for us. Whereas consumerism says our identity is to consume more so as to be more in this world. Christianity is to rest under the providential care of our Heavenly Father as his children. I look at my 2 girls and I love the fact that they don't worry about paying the CUC bills. They don't worry about paying rent or a health insurance. They don't worry about whether they'll have enough clothes or whether there'll be dinner at the end of the day. They have this wonderful sense of rest and joy that Dad's got this or Mom's got this. They have a wonderful sense of who they are and who they belong to. And there's contentment there. But I know for some of us, it's not about consumerism at this moment that's competing for our satisfaction in Jesus. It literally is the situation that we're in. I just want to speak into this for just a moment. Now, yes, we all have unique situations, whether it be your specific job or relationships or whatever it might be. But as an island, we are all in the same situation, but we have very differing views and opinions on the circumstance that we're in. Some of us feel our freedom at this stage is being oppressed, and others of us feel, no, that's fine, because out of fear of what COVID might do to this island. And not to mention the great debate, whether to be vaccinated or not vaccinated. But what's happening is that there is a polarization. A polarization is happening not just on Cayman, we're seeing it in the States, we're seeing it all around the globe. And what we're doing is we're inadvertently fighting for our contentment by fighting for our viewpoints or our rights. If my rights can be satisfied, then I will be happy, then I will be content. And I totally understand that thinking. You need to understand, even as a staff, we were wrestling with this week, and I've been wrestling with it. But then as I was studying this passage this week, and I see Paul saying something like this: I have learned to be content in whatever the situation I am. That's a real challenge to me. And you might be thinking, well, careful, Jason, he's talking about his basic needs being met. But think about the situation that he's in. He is in prison, which is affecting his needs. And he's in prison because of preaching the gospel. Surely Paul could have said, hey, well, wait a minute. I have a right to believe what I want to believe and say what I want to say. I have freedom of speech. But he doesn't do that. He first and foremost fights for his contentment in Jesus. And then guess what he does? He carries on talking about Jesus. He preaches the gospel to the prison guards. He writes the very word of God to the Philippians. In fact, he writes what is known as the prison epistles. He writes Philippians, he writes Ephesians, Colossians, and Philemon. Now, if we were there, we might be tempted to say, hey, whoa, Paul, you've got to stop, buddy. Your situation could change for the better if you just hold off for a second. Wait until your situation changes. Wait until you're released. And then when you're in a safer region, then preach the gospel, then carry on. But Paul's whole argument is that his contentment is not about his situation, it's not about his rights. It's about the mission of the God for whom he lives for and loves and finds his contentment in. You see what I'm saying? Think about it this way. What happens? What happens if you fight for your contentment in your situation and you get it? You get what you want. You know what's going to happen next? Another situation is going to come along that's going to disturb your homeostasis, your satisfaction. Because that's the nature of living in a fallen world. And that's Paul's argument here. Is that there is another way to be content, despite, as he says here, in whatever situation we find ourselves in. So Sunrise, don't hear what I'm not saying. I'm not here to tell you which point of view you can and can't have and how you are to respond and how you're not to respond. That's not what this is about. I'm here to point you to where you should fight for your contentment first and foremost, and then allow that to dictate how you feel about your situation and your circumstances and how you are to react or respond to it. You think, yeah, Jason, easier said than done. Because I feel so angry, and I get that. I feel so frustrated. Or I feel so nervous. I feel so anxious. I feel so fearful about what could happen. And I understand that too. Or maybe for some of you, like, I'm so over the COVID thing. There are so many other situations that I'm not content in. And so how do I fight for my satisfaction in Jesus? Well, let's look at the last point together. Point number 3. There's a secret strength. Look at verse 12. It says, I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. You see how he describes life? Life is made up of circumstances. And in some circumstances or in some seasons, we'll have plenty, we'll have an abundance. Things can be really going well. Work's going well. Not only are you getting paid well, but the job is stimulating. You've got great colleagues around you. Or you're going through a really good patch in your health, which most of the time goes unnoticed until we fall ill, right? For Paul, maybe it might have been great ministry seasons like meeting Timothy. Hey, here's a guy that I can just pour everything into and mentor, and then who would then go on to become a great gospel minister himself. Or planting churches everywhere and people coming to faith. But because we're living in a fallen world, things can turn around, sometimes in a blink of an eye. Paul experienced this a lot. Just listen to this. He wrote this in 2 Corinthians 11. He says, I have worked much harder, been in prison more frequently, been flogged more severely, and been exposed to death again and again. 5 times I received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was pelted with stones. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I spent a night and a day in the open sea. I have been constantly on the move. I have been in danger from rivers, danger from bandits, danger from my fellow Jews, danger from the Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the country, danger at sea, and danger from false believers. He says, I've labored and toiled and have often gone without sleep. I have known hunger and thirst, and I've often gone without food. I have been cold and naked. He says, beside everything else, and I'm thinking, Paul, what else could there be? But he says, beside everything else, I face daily the pressure of my concern for all the churches. He has this wonderful love and concern for all the churches that he planted, on top of everything that he's experienced. Verse 29, he just gets really real with us. He says this, who is weak? And I do not feel weak? Rhetorical question. He says, who is led into sin? And he says, and I do not inwardly burn? And so for many of, or some of these things we can identify with them, but for many we can't. There are some serious lows there. And so we think, well, Paul, how did you do it? How did you not let the highs and the lows of life, and sometimes even the traumas in your life, not affect your contentment? He says there's a secret. But notice he says that this secret is learned. The nature of most secrets is that they are discovered, right? They're suddenly revealed. But Paul says, no, not this one. This one is learned. This secret was learned by experience and in the classroom of highs and lows, in the hard knocks of life. And so what is it? Look at verse 13, the most misquoted verse in the whole Bible. Verse 13, I can do all things through him, through Jesus, who strengthens me. Having spent the last 40 years of my life in South Africa, where the game of rugby is a religion, so many Christian players would pray this verse or quote this verse before running out onto the field to smash someone or tackle someone. It's not what Paul meant. The all things that Jesus gives strength for is for the highs and the lows of life. Jesus gives us strength to sustain us through whatever comes our way. What's so interesting in Jesus, he says, we have the strength to even handle the abundant seasons in our lives. So that this strength then ensures that we don't take those times for granted. That it doesn't become the reason for our contentment. And the strength protects us from making it our identity or our security. It protects us from total mental and emotional crashes when the lows come, because they will come, because we're living in a fallen world. When we lose our job, when we lose someone, we lose a relationship, we don't get our way, the borders stay closed or they open or whatever it might be. See, it is strength to be content in Jesus, and therefore the strength to continue to live out the calling that He has over our lives despite the situations that we're in. Warren Wiersbe explains this power like this. He says, all of nature depends on hidden resources. He says, the great trees, they send their roots down into the earth to draw up water and minerals. He says, rivers, they have their sources in the snow-capped mountains. The most important part of a tree is the part that you cannot see, the root system. And the most important part of the Christian's life is the part that God sees. He says, unless we draw on the deep resources of God by faith, we will fail against the pressures of life. Paul depended on the power of Christ and at work in his life. I can through Christ was Paul's motto. And he says it can be our motto as well. So Jesus is not just providentially in control over all of our situations, using them for our good and for His glory, but He also gives us the strength to endure or persevere throughout the various seasons and situations that we find ourselves in. And as we rely on Him, as we rely on His strength, we'll begin to see His faithfulness time and time again come through for us. And as that happens, all the stuff and all the things of this world will begin to lose their power over us. Our consumer mentality begins to lose control as our passion for Jesus gains control. That's contentment, Sunrise. When the things of this world grow dimmer and the glory and the mission and the purpose of Jesus grows brighter in our lives, that's when we truly begin to feel content.